If you were a father or a mother, what would you do if your little child was slapped right there in the middle of first class, just because someone thought your kid didn't belong there? On AstraSky Flight 901, surrounded by pristine white leather seats and the soft clink of wine glasses, 8-year-old Nova Langston, the only daughter of Black billionaire Renee Langston, founder of the global ethics empire. Langston Ethics sat quietly in seat 2A. She didn't cry. She didn't fight back. She simply looked straight at flight attendant Leslie Morrow, the woman who had just slapped her, believing the little girl had sat in the wrong seat. In that moment, the cabin froze. On one side, the invisible weight of prejudice. On the other, the quiet strength of dignity. And just 1 minute later, the entire $1.3 billion fortune of AstraSky Airlines was frozen solid. If it were you, would you scream for justice or stay silent and let justice speak for itself? Join me as we step into the story. Flight attendant attacks, daughter of Black billionaire. In first class 1 minute later, 1.3 be frozen. A story where justice doesn't need words, only truth. If you believe silence can sometimes be the greatest power of all, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to join me on this journey of silent justice. The hum of the jet engines hung in the air, like a single note held too long in a sealed chamber. Morning light spilled through the cabin windows, glinting off rows of white leather seats, as if this place no longer belonged to the earth, but to a higher layer of the sky, where people believed that wealth and status could separate them from everything ordinary below. In seat 2A, little Nova Langston sat quietly. Her hair was braided into 2 neat plaits, her black shoes polished to a mirror shine. A crisp white shirt, ironed without a wrinkle, made her look like a quiet note misplaced in the symphony of adults rushing to open laptops, order wine, and skim financial papers. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. Nova simply opened the small book on her lap, the cover painted with a pale blue sky, and silver letters that read, "The Ethics of the Invisible." Then came Leslie Morrow, the flight's chief attendant. Her heels tapped against the floor, a rhythm of small authority, the kind born from uniforms, checklists, and the belief that one is just doing their job. But there was something sharp and uncertain in Leslie's eyes. She stopped at seat 2A, gaze sweeping from the little black girl's hair to her shoes. "Sweetheart, are you sure you're in the right seat?" Her voice was sweet, but sweet, like honey over glass. A few passengers turned to look. A silver-haired man raised an eyebrow. A middle-aged woman pursed her lips in agreement. In first class, no one liked trouble. They wanted smooth flights, quiet meals, and the comfort of believing everything was just as it should be. Nova didn't answer. She simply handed over her boarding pass, a sturdy white card embossed with gold letters. AstraSky 901, seat 2A, Langston, Nova. Leslie took it, glanced down, then gave a faint, condescending smile. "Maybe your mom made a mistake. Honey, this section's for first-class passengers." The words fell softly like feathers, but carried the weight of a century of prejudice. At the service counter, Elise Tran, a young Asian trainee attendant, froze mid-step. She saw Nova's hand tighten on the seat's edge, then release. A tiny gesture almost invisible, but behind those calm, young eyes lay an ocean of silence. Leslie leaned closer, her tone sharper. "Sweetheart, are you listening? This seat." The slap came out of nowhere. No one saw the hand land, only heard the sharp crack echoing off the cabin walls. A sound that felt like an accusation against everyone present. Then silence. A silence so raw, it made people feel naked, Elise dropped her tray. Droplets of water glittered mid-air like scattered stars. Someone coughed. A man stammered, "Did she just—" Leslie stepped back, her face flushed. Ta was following security protocol. I thought she stopped. She didn't know what she thought, because right in front of her, Nova hadn't moved. She wasn't crying. She wasn't looking at her. She simply reached for the small silver bracelet on her wrist, the Guardian band, now glowing faintly blue, like the quiet breath of a sleeping sky. A soft beep followed, barely audible, yet it carried farther than sound could reach. No one on that plane knew that. Thousands of miles away in Geneva, inside the Langston Ethics Corporation's global operations hub, a system had just been triggered. Code name, Code Blue, minor harm status, global activation. Elise looked at Nova, voice trembling. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Nova turned, her eyes crystal clear, calm beyond her years. "I'm okay, ma'am." Her voice was soft, but every syllable was steady, unbroken. Leslie opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. In that child's gaze, she saw not defiance, but a mirror, a reflection of her own conscience staring right back at her. The engine still hummed. The cabin was still, but the air had shifted as if someone had quietly pulled all the oxygen out of the room. No one knew it yet, but that single gesture, that small hand touching a glowing bracelet, was the beginning of the greatest moral reckoning in aviation history. While AstraSky 901 sliced through clouds toward Munich, an invisible signal spread across satellites. In Geneva, Renee Langston, founder of Langston Ethics, and Nova's mother looked up from her screen as a message flashed before her eyes. Guardian Activation Level 1, Child Harm. No alarms, no flashing lights, just silence. A silence that demanded to be heard. Elise whispered, I don't know what just happened. It feels like we all witnessed something bigger than a slap." No one replied. Leslie Morrow sat down, her hands trembling, face pale. She knew in this age, eyes were always watching. But she never imagined that the quiet gaze of a child would be the mirror forcing her to face the truth. From seat 2A. Nova turned toward the window. The sky was still blue. The plane still flew. Everything seemed the same. But in that faint blue reflection from her bracelet, something fundamental had changed, not just in the data systems of the world, but in the conscience of humankind. In that moment, justice didn't speak. It simply touched a child's wrist, and the world began to listen. As the plane drifted quietly through the clouds, no one in that cabin knew that every passing second was pulling the world closer to a new kind of truth, where justice was no longer a judgment passed by humans, but a response born from the dignity of a child. The engines purred softly, a silver river flowing through the sky. But inside the first-class cabin, the air was thick enough to hear the sound of a heartbeat. It all happened in seconds. A slap, a child, and a strange silence spreading through the air like an invisible tide. Elise Tran, the trainee flight attendant, stood frozen in the aisle. The tray slipped from her hands, and water splashed across the floor like sudden rain. The sound of shattering glass made a few passengers flinch, but no one spoke. The man in seat 3B gripped his armrest. A white woman in glasses stared, then quickly looked away. No one wanted to be involved. In a place where one seat cost more than their monthly salary, silence was the only ticket to safety. Leslie Morrow, the chief flight attendant, stood paralyzed. She hadn't meant to actually hit the child, but the moment her hand made contact, she felt every gaze in the cabin turn toward her. Not angry gazes, but shocked ones. And inside that shock, there was judgment. I was just following protocol. Leslie stammered. "I thought she was in the wrong seat. I was just enforcing security rules." The words fell flat, like a broken defense tossed into a void. No one responded. In front of her, Nova Langston sat still. She raised a small hand and gently touched the silver bracelet on her wrist. A faint blue light flickered subtle, but enough to tint the cabin's light for a moment. No sound, no alarm, just a quiet wave of invisible energy spreading outward cold. Calm, deliberate. Elise saw it, and in that instant, she knew something vast, something beyond her understanding, had just been awakened. From the front row, a white passenger leaned over. "Whose kid is that?" he whispered. No one answered, but the question made others start to really look. Leslie tried to steady herself, her voice trembling. "She needs to learn some respect. This is first class, not a playground." Elise heard every word from across the cabin. She knew Leslie wasn't evil, just someone who had lived too long believing skin color dictated place. But what made Elise's chest tighten wasn't Leslie's words. It was Nova's response. No tears, no anger, no defiance. The little girl simply looked down at her hands, as if listening to something distant, something far beyond insult. Elise knelt to pick up the broken tray, her eyes still on Nova. In the dim blue reflection from the bracelet, she caught sight of a tiny emblem engraved on its surface, 3 interlocking circles, with a glowing point at the center. She'd seen that symbol before in a news segment about aviation ethics technology, the Skyveil system, a global safety and moral response network created by Langston Ethics Corporation. Her breath caught. "It can't be," she whispered. If she was right, that little girl was... Leslie's voice broke her thoughts. Rambling now. Desperate. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. I just wanted to maintain order on this flight." No one replied. A few passengers quietly reached for their phones, thought about recording, then hesitated and stopped. The only sounds left were the low hum of the fans and Leslie's uneven breathing. Nova turned to the window. Outside, the clouds drifted like white silk ribbons. She closed her eyes slowly. The faint blue glow spread, brushing softly across the cabin walls like mist. Elise felt something change, not a noise, but a sensation. It was as if every camera, every microphone, every signal in that cabin had just come alive. No one realized it yet, but the Skyveil system had begun recording, capturing every detail, every sound, every gesture of what would later be known as the strike. Each frame, each breath, each glance was transmitted thousands of miles away to Geneva, the global command center of Langston Ethics. And there, a woman leaving a board meeting looked up at her screen just as the alert appeared. Guardian activation, child distress detected. Her name was Renee Langston. She stopped mid-step in the glass hallway, her hand tightening around a silver ring, her eyes calm as a frozen lake flickered with a glint of steel. Back on the plane. Leslie tried to recover some control. "Really? I didn't mean any harm." "The girl has to understand." Elise cut her off. "Leslie, stop." Her voice was soft, but it carried authority. "We just crossed a line no one should ever cross." Leslie blinked. "You're taking her side. You realize I can report you for insubordination?" "No," Elise said evenly. "I just think we may have made a mistake with someone we don't understand at all." Elise didn't know it then, but her words were prophetic. Because within 60 seconds, the entire digital infrastructure of AstraSky Airlines would begin to shut down account by account, server by server, line by line. Nova remained motionless, eyes on the window. There was something in her calmness that made everyone else afraid to breathe. No one saw a child anymore, only a silence that felt heavy enough to break steel. It was the silence of someone who knew that truth didn't need to shout, because justice would always find its way home. Elise watched her, feeling a chill rise in her chest. Not fear of the child, but fear of what was coming. 1 minute later, the cabin clock flickered. The Wi-Fi signal disappeared. The system screens flashed system override, Skyveil code blue initiated. Leslie's head snapped up. What's happening? No one answered. Nova opened her eyes calm, clear, and cold as dawn. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it filled the room. Justice always knows the way home. The cabin fell silent. 1 minute passed and the world began to shift. As the Skyveil signal pulsed beyond the clouds, reaching the operations hub in Geneva, a silent earthquake began, one where intelligence and ethics would soon eclipse human authority. At over 30,000 feet above Europe, AstraSky 901 sailed smoothly through the clouds. No one in the cabin knew that every movement, every glance, every heartbeat was being recorded with the precision of a pulse. On Nova Langston's small wrist, the silver guardian band still glowed faintly blue, nearly blending into the reflection of the window beside her. But thousands of miles away in Geneva, Switzerland, the beating heart of Langston Ethics began to stir. On the 47th floor, Renee Langston, CEO of Langston Ethics, was preparing to leave a meeting with the International Ethics Council when the screen on her desk flickered. A soft blue shimmer pulsed across the display, followed by a single alert one only. She could hear Guardian activation detected. Code blue, minor harm. Renee froze. She didn't need an explanation. The system only activated under two circumstances: a threat to life, or an ethical violation against a protected individual. And the protected individual this time was her daughter. In an instant, the voices around her faded in meaningless murmurs. The world blurred until there was only the steady rhythm of her heartbeat and the blue pulse on her wrist synchronized perfectly with Nova's guardian band. She exhaled once and placed her hand on the touch panel. Her voice was calm, low, and deliberate. System override code blue, minor harm. Immediately, the room filled with light. Data grids, satellite paths, and flight telemetry appeared across her screen. AstraSky 901, active. Manual control suspended. Ethical command authorized. Engineers in the Geneva control hub froze before they could react. Langston Ethics had assumed full operational authority over AstraSky 901. Divert route, Renee said. Destination, replied the system. Munich International. Priority access. 1 second later, the map shifted. Far above the cold expanse of the North Sea, AstraSky 901 tilted gently, altering course, and no one in the cockpit yet knew why. Captain Rosario glanced at his controls. Luca, did you just change our heading? His co-pilot shook his head. No, sir, but the system's updating automatically. It says he squinted at the screen. Skyveil protocol engaged. Command authority, Langston Ethics. Rosario frowned. Langston. Why does that name sound familiar? In first class. Elise Tran felt the slight tilt of the aircraft. Are we changing course? She asked quietly. Leslie Morrow didn't answer. She was staring at her phone, which had suddenly lost Wi-Fi. Nova sat calmly, one hand resting on her book, the bracelet still glowing a soft, rhythmic light, like the steady breathing of the sky itself. No one knew it yet, but at that moment, the entire operational network of AstraSky Airlines was being locked down. Every data server, every bank transaction, every internal system sealed tight. Only Langston Ethics Headquarters retained access. Renee strode through the glass corridor, the pulse of blue light following her like a second heartbeat. Her assistant, Michael Shore, hurried to keep up. "Madam Langston, what's happening?" "The Guardian code just activated from AstraSky 901, she replied. Without slowing, Nova is on that flight. Michael's eyes widened. "Oh my God. Then we intervene," Renee said flatly. "Not with words, with data." She stopped in front of the panoramic window overlooking Lake Geneva, its surface shimmering under the morning light. "You know, Michael," she said quietly, "some mistakes don't need to be shouted about. They just need to be recorded. In the operations hub." Engineers stared at the flood of data streaming in. "Ma'am," one of them called out, "we're receiving a full feed from the first-class cabin video, audio, everything, on the main display." The image of Nova Langston appeared, her cheek still bearing the faint red mark, her expression calm. Beside her, Leslie Morrow's face was pale, frozen mid-defense. Elise stood nearby, caught between confusion and realization. Renee said nothing. She didn't need to. That single frame, Nova's hand touching the bracelet, the blue flare spreading outward, was enough. A silent cry, encoded in light. She turned to her team. "Send an emergency lockdown order to AstraSky Holdings. All connected assets freeze for 60 seconds. At that same moment, CEO Paul Dermott sat in a crowded conference hall when his phone began to vibrate uncontrollably. The screen flashed, "Langston Ethics Alert, Skyveil violation detected. Asset lockdown initiated. Within 60 seconds, $1.3 billion in corporate assets were frozen under the Emergency Compliance Act, a clause AstraSky itself had signed with Langston Ethics 2 years earlier." Paul stared at the message in disbelief. "What the hell is going on?" A trembling assistant leaned in. "Sir, it seems to involve a passenger named Nova Langston." Paul's face drained of color. Renee stood silently before the wall of screens. On one, Nova gazed out the airplane window, the faintest smile playing on her lips. Through the glass reflection, Renee saw her own image, the woman who had built Skyveil to protect human dignity, now watching it awaken for the first time, to defend her child. She whispered, "Nova, you did the right thing." Then she placed her hand on the command console. "Skyveil command acknowledgement confirmed. Code Blue active. Flight diverted to Munich International for ethical review." From that moment on, AstraSky 901 no longer belonged to any airline. It no longer obeyed the pilots, the board, or even International Aviation Control. It belonged to justice, a justice written in code, guided by ethics, and awakened by a child who never said a word. Under the sterile white lights of the Geneva hub, Renee closed her eyes. She could feel the rhythm of the system, the breath of a vast, living conscience awakening across the globe. She knew that within the hour, the entire world would learn what had happened aboard AstraSky 901. But she wasn't afraid, because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with a siren. It comes as a signal, silent and undeniable. Ho, ho. As the plane began its descent toward Munich, no one on board realized they were now witnesses to history, a turning point where a single slap would ignite the greatest moral conversation of the technological age. And that was the moment the manifest revelation began to unfold. AstraSky Flight 901 cruised steadily toward Munich on its newly diverted path. From the outside, it looked like any other commercial jet cutting across the sky, but inside, every breath and every glance carried the weight of fear, guilt, and realization. That slap, once just a rash act, had now grown beyond the limits of personal mistake. It was becoming the spark in a chain reaction, a moment that would make everyone on board realize they stood in the middle of something much larger than themselves. Hitur, my. Elise Tran's hands were trembling as she bent to pick up a sheet of paper that had fallen the flight manifest, printed in bold ink with every first-class passenger's name. Out of habit, she glanced through the list and then froze. Seat 2A, Nova Langston, and beneath that, under Guardian Renee Langston, CEO, Langston Ethics Corporation. The air around her seemed to solidify. Elise lifted her gaze toward the first row, where Nova still sat quietly, hands folded over her small book. The soft blue light from her Guardian band pulsed gently against the seat, a heartbeat made of truth and silence. A few steps away, Leslie Morrow stood rigid, sweat gathering at her temples. "What's going on?" she snapped, her voice sharp, desperate to reclaim the authority slipping through her fingers. Elise didn't respond immediately. She simply handed the manifest to Leslie. "You should see this." Leslie frowned and then went pale as her eyes hit the name Langston. For a heartbeat, the entire cabin fell utterly silent. "Langston," she whispered. No, that can't be." Elise nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "The girl is the daughter of Renee Langston, the founder of Skyveil, the global ethics system AstraSky implemented last year." Leslie staggered back, nearly losing her balance. She remembered the mandatory corporate trainings, the repeated references to Langston ethics, the gold standard of moral governance in modern aviation. It was Renee Langston who had written the very guidelines she was supposed to uphold to protect the dignity of every passenger, regardless of race, status, or circumstance. And now, Leslie realized she had just struck the daughter of the woman who wrote those words. In her mind, 1,000 sounds collided her own voice, the hum of the engines, the faint murmurs of passengers, and the echo of the slap still ringing like a confession. She wanted to explain, to insist it was a misunderstanding, but what defense could survive when the entire world was watching through a system built by the girl's mother? Elise kept her eyes on her. There was no judgment in her expression, only sorrow. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "Leslie, you do understand?" "Right. Everything's already been transmitted. Nova's Guardian band triggered Skyveil. Geneva has the feed." Leslie's voice cracked. "You mean they're watching?" Elise nodded. "Every second. And not just them. The entire European ethics network is interconnected. They know what happened." Leslie lifted a trembling hand to her face. She didn't cry, but her body seemed to fold inward. Around them, whispers began to ripple through the cabin. Passengers leaned close, murmuring behind hands. "Who is she?" one businessman asked. Another replied quietly, "They're saying she's the daughter of Renee Langston, the woman who created Skyveil." "Oh my God." Someone breathed. No one spoke above a whisper. No one dared approach the little girl. They all looked and kept looking at Nova Langston. She gazed out the window, the red mark on her cheek fading, her eyes calm, untroubled, almost luminous. Elise approached gently. "Nova," she said softly, "I'm sorry for not stopping it in time." Nova turned her head. Her voice was steady, almost serene. "It's okay, Miss Elise. Everything's already been recorded." The words were light, but they carried the weight of certainty. Elise felt a chill run through her. This wasn't coldness. It was conviction, the quiet confidence of someone who knew justice would arrive. Not with anger, but with truth. Leslie sank into the nearest seat, hollow-eyed. From the cockpit, a chime sounded, followed by the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, We are diverting to Munich International for operational review. Each syllable landed like a verdict. Elise glanced at Leslie, not with resentment, but with the heavy empathy of witnessing a person confront her own blindness. She saw not a villain, but a human being, a woman. Realizing that prejudice doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it whispers from inside the rules we think we're following. In the service cabin, Elise opened a side console to verify the data stream. The internal log glowed on the display. Skyveil Protocol Active Incident ID FL901492. Guardian Renee Langston. Subject minor harm verified. That single word verified pulsed on screen, sealing everything. From that moment on, the incident no longer belonged to AstraSky Airlines, nor to the flight crew. It belonged to Langston Ethics, and to Renee Langston, who was already en route to Munich. Elise returned to the cabin. Nova was still seated, hands folded like she was praying. No one dared speak to her now. Even Leslie sat beside her in silence, head bowed, words lost. A passenger whispered, "Sometimes justice doesn't need to speak. It only needs to be seen." Elise heard it, and something inside her stirred, a mix of sorrow and reverence. She looked at Nova again, this quiet child who didn't fight, didn't scream, didn't demand to belong. She simply sat, waiting not for vengeance, but for the world to answer itself. Somewhere high above, an encrypted signal raced across the stratosphere toward Geneva. There, Renee Langston stood before her screen, her face unreadable, but her eyes burned with one truth the world was about to learn. No one has the right to strip another of their dignity, not even for a moment. As the plane continued toward Munich, each soul on board began to understand they were no longer witnesses to a single event, but participants in history, a moment when justice itself was being rewritten in the language of data, and through the quiet strength of a child named Nova Langston. The cabin behind them was silent now, the kind of silence that grows when everyone realizes they've become part of something far greater than themselves. In the cockpit, where every movement was measured in seconds, justice had begun to speak not through human voices, but through data. Captain Rosario glanced across the control panel. A faint blue light pulsed among the hundreds of steady green indicators. He frowned. "Luca, do you see that co-pilot?" Luca leaned closer to the auxiliary screen. The message appeared crisp, clinical, and unmistakable. Skyveil alert code blue minor harm. The two men locked eyes, and for several seconds, neither spoke. They both knew what code blue meant. It wasn't a technical malfunction. It was an ethical breach, one being monitored directly by Langston Ethics, the global oversight network they had only ever read about in training manuals. Until now. Rosario adjusted the control lever gently, no response. He switched to manual override. The display flickered, then printed a new message: manual control disabled, Skyveil protocol engaged. He exhaled sharply. This can't be. The entire control system's been locked out. Luca scrolled through the diagnostics. "Captain, the system's taken over everything. Heading, altitude, comms. We're in observation mode." Rosario turned his head. "Observation mode? You mean we're not in control of this aircraft anymore?" Luca nodded slowly. "That's right, sir. The plane no longer belongs to AstraSky." The cockpit fell still. Not the silence of failure, but the silence of power being quietly transferred. Rosario stared out the front glass as the golden tint of sunset bled across the wing. "I've been flying for over 20 years, Luca," he said softly. Never thought I'd see the day a system could take the controls from a human. In a single blink. Luca looked down at the glowing blue interface. Maybe it knows something we don't. Sir. Rosario didn't reply. He didn't have to. Both men understood Skyveil only activated on verified ethical violations, and a code blue meant the harmed individual was under direct guardian protection. Meanwhile, in the service galley, Elise Tran was gently helping Nova Langston adjust her seatbelt. No words were exchanged, but Elise's eyes kept drifting toward the cockpit door, toward the place where control itself had slipped out of human hands. Another message flashed on the cockpit screen. Flight diverted. Munich International Airport. Authority Langston Ethics HQ. Rosario gave a quiet, resigned laugh. Munich. Of course. Neutral ground. Luca's voice was hesitant. Captain, do you think this is about the girl? Rosario nodded once. You remember last year's ethics training? They told us Skyveil was built to ensure that morality always stands above power. He glanced at the glowing message again. Maybe today, we're finally seeing that promise kept. A new window opened on the main monitor, a live feed from the first-class camera. Nova sat perfectly still, the faint blue halo from her bracelet lighting her lap. Beside her, Leslie Morrow, the chief attendant, bowed her head, hands clasped together in shame. Rosario sighed. What did she do? Luca's voice was low. It wasn't just a slap. Captain, it was proof of the very flaw this system was designed to correct. The hum of the engines filled the silence. Data packets streamed invisibly through the network, every sound and gesture encrypted and sent to Geneva. No human was deciding right or wrong anymore. Justice was being computed, frame by frame, heartbeat by heartbeat. Rosario leaned back, eyes on the blinking blue indicator. You know what's strange? Luca. What's that? Sir. He smiled faintly. We've lost control of this aircraft, yet somehow I feel safer. Luca looked at him, puzzled. Why? Rosario's gaze drifted out toward the fading horizon. Because whoever's guiding this flight right now isn't just a machine. It's the mind that built it. And if Renee Langston is the mother of that child, then I trust she knows exactly what she's doing. In the cabin, Leslie Morrow had been quietly instructed to take a seat at the very back. Her tablet buzzed once, displaying an internal notice personnel under ethical observation, direct communication restricted. Elise's service console lit up at the same moment, transferring primary cabin authority to her. She looked toward Leslie. The woman who once barked orders now sat frozen, powerless to even touch a control panel. Power had shifted not through shouting, not through vengeance, but through data, the coldest, most impartial form of justice. Thousands of miles away, in Geneva, the operations hub glowed in a sea of blue light. Rows of analysts and ethicists monitored the incoming streams from AstraSky 901. Ma'am, a young engineer reported to Renee Langston. The system is stable. Code Blue data confirmed at 100%. Pilots are in supervised observation. Renee nodded slowly, her tone calm but unwavering. No one here is losing their freedom. It's just that, for the first time, justice doesn't need permission to be carried out. Nempong, Den Obi. Back on the plane, Elise looked at Nova and said softly, You know, Nova, most people think justice is a gavel in a courtroom. But today I saw it. It's just a single touch of your hand on that bracelet. Nova turned to her with a small, knowing smile. Justice isn't meant to punish. Miss Elise, it's meant to teach people how to look again. Elise fell silent, and in that silence, she understood no system, no machine. Not even Skyveil was stronger than human dignity itself. Skyveil wasn't the judge. It was only the mirror. Nene, huayan. As the plane continued its silent path toward Munich, streams of encrypted data painted a new map of the world, a world where truth no longer needed a voice to be heard. And when the doors opened, Renee Langston would be there, waiting. The wheels touched down with a deep, drawn-out rumble. Inside the cabin, there was no applause, no chatter, only the uneasy quiet of people realizing that what waited outside wasn't just the Munich tarmac. It was judgment. Through the small oval window, Elise Tran saw a line of silver-gray vehicles pulling up beside the aircraft. No cameras, no reporters, only a few figures in slate uniforms, the Langston Ethics emblem gleaming on their chests. They didn't need introductions. Their presence alone was enough to make every crew member hold their breath. The cabin door opened. No announcement, no formalities, just a shift in the air, and then Renee Langston stepped in. No entourage, no jewelry, just a long charcoal coat and a silver bracelet identical to Nova's. Her stride was calm, her expression unreadable eyes like steel, but lit from within. She stopped at the threshold of the first-class aisle. Her gaze swept across the silent cabin, the air thick with shame and awe. Elise bowed slightly, but Renee only gave a faint nod. Her focus already fixed ahead on seat 2A. There sat Nova Langston, still, composed, her small hands folded in her lap. When she saw her mother, she didn't run. She didn't cry. Renee knelt before her, placing one hand gently against her cheek, the faint red mark still visible. Her voice was soft, meant for her daughter alone. "You did the right thing, Nova." Nova nodded, calm as the sky outside. No one dared speak. Renee rose slowly and turned toward Leslie Morrow, the flight attendant sitting rigid 2 rows away. Their eyes met. One was a woman who once believed she ruled the cabin. The other, a woman whose systems now ruled the sky. Renee's voice was low, deliberate. "You struck my daughter." No sound broke the moment. Leslie's lips trembled. I didn't mean to." Renee raised her hand slightly, a gesture sharp enough to cut the air. "You don't need to explain. Skyveil recorded everything. I'm not here to hear excuses." She turned to Elise. "Is the rest of the crew stable?" "Yes, ma'am," Elise replied quietly. "Everyone has cooperated." Renee nodded once, then faced Leslie again. "Effective immediately. You are suspended under Section 7.3 of the Operational Ethics Agreement. All passengers on this flight will serve as witnesses." Leslie's breath came shallow, trembling. It wasn't fear of losing her job. It was knowing what came next. Once someone was ethically declassified, no airline, no corporate entity, no public institution would touch them again. "Please," Leslie choked out. "I didn't know who she was." Renee's eyes hardened, but her tone stayed steady. "And if she weren't my daughter, if she were just another child, would you have acted any differently?" Leslie froze. No words came. Renee's reply was calm as ice. "Justice doesn't care who we are. It only cares what we do." Elise lowered her head, her hands tightening. She could see Leslie unraveling not from punishment, but from realization. And the worst pain of all was knowing the truth too late to change it. Renee drew a breath and signaled to the 2 Langston ethics officers beside her. "Escort Ms. Morrow off the aircraft. Ensure her legal and physical safety." Leslie stood unsteady, pale. As she passed Nova, she stopped for just a moment. her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." Nova's reply was soft, almost like a sigh. "I know. No anger, no forgiveness, just acknowledgement, and sometimes that is punishment enough." Renee straightened and looked around the cabin. Did anyone witness the full incident? A man in seat 3B, silver-haired, dignified, raised his hand. "I did. I'll testify." Then another, and another, at least two, one by one. They stood not because they were asked to, but because this time no one wanted to be silent. Renee's eyes softened for the first time. "Thank you. Systems can record truth, but only people can give it courage. Thank you for choosing to speak." She reached for Nova's hand. "Let's go home." Mother and daughter walked down the aisle. No cameras, no applause, no spectacle. Just the quiet rhythm of their footsteps echoing against the cabin floor. As they crossed the jet bridge, Elise watched from the doorway. No one looked directly at them, yet every eye shimmered with tears. Outside, the Munich air was crisp and cold. A soft wind caught Renee's coat, rippling it like a banner. She knelt briefly beside Nova and whispered, "Justice doesn't need to be loud. Sweetheart, it only needs us not to look away." Nova nodded, lips pressed together, gaze lifted toward the clouds where AstraSky 901's contrail still glowed faintly in the fading light. From the doorway, Elise watched them disappear down the ramp, and she realized something profound. What she had witnessed wasn't the power of technology or wealth, but the power of silence, guided by wisdom, the kind that made even an empire bow its head without a single raised voice. As the mother and daughter vanished into the cold Munich air, Skyveil's full data log was released to the International Ethics Council. What had happened aboard AstraSky 901 was no longer an isolated event. It was a reckoning for the entire aviation industry. Munich, the next morning. The story of AstraSky Flight 901 had spread across the globe faster than any aircraft could ever fly. Within 8 hours, an 8-second clip, the slap that silenced the sky, had been extracted, verified, and transmitted directly to AstraSky's global headquarters in New York. On the 54th floor, in the nerve center of the airline empire, Paul Dermott, CEO of AstraSky, sat motionless before a massive wall screen. He had watched the video 3 times, and still, he couldn't look away from the 4th second, the frozen instant when Leslie Morrow's hand struck the face of Nova Langston. No sound, no scream, just a slap clean, simple, undeniable, delivered in the very space meant to symbolize human progress. Paul muted the feed, rewound again. In the lower corner of the frame, the faint pulse of blue light from Nova's Guardian band glowed small, steady, unyielding. He leaned back, hands clasped, eyes hollow. In them was a blend of disbelief, shame, and a kind of fear that only those at the top ever feel, the fear of being seen by the truth. Across the control room, digital alerts cascaded down the glass panels. And Fly with Nova, trending #1 worldwide. Langston Ethics confirms Skyveil activation protocol. Valid UN Aviation Board demands AstraSky explanation within 48 hours. Each headline landed like a digital verdict. Sophie Green, AstraSky's communications director, entered the room pale, tense. "You've seen it," she asked quietly. Paul didn't turn. His eyes stayed on the replay. "Yes," he said softly, "and so is the world." Sophie hesitated, then said, "They're calling it the slap that made the sky go silent." But what people are really seeing is power flipping upside down. Paul closed his eyes. "We always said Skyveil was just a safeguard for ethics. Turns out, it's a mirror. And yesterday we saw ourselves in it." He glanced at the report blinking on his desk. Langston Ethics requests temporary suspension of all Skyveil integrated flights pending compliance review. He read it twice. A temporary suspension that meant grounding nearly half of AstraSky's global fleet. Billions in losses every day. But he knew there was no other choice. He inhaled slowly, then spoke to his aide. Send the directive. All international flights operating under Skyveil integration are suspended until further notice. The room fell silent. Every executive turned toward him, waiting for a retraction that never came. Paul added quietly, "We can't keep flying while justice is in free fall." Within 15 minutes, the announcement hit the airwaves. Headlines lit up screens across continents. AstraSky grounds fleet after Langston incident. CEO confirms ethics breach under Skyveil review. Skyveil faces global oversight inquiry. And as the official statement spread, so did something else, a movement. At first, it was a handful of social posts, then a tidal wave, Fly with Nova. People around the world began to share their own stories. Passengers of color questioned for their seats. Travelers doubted for their presence. From Nairobi, a mother wrote, "I saw my daughter in Nova. The way she stayed quiet, that's the kind of courage we've forgotten." From London, a black flight attendant shared, "They told us we were being too sensitive." But now, Skyveil proved something. Morality isn't a feeling. It's a fact. At Langston Ethics headquarters in Geneva, Renee Langston received the update AstraSky had grounded its fleet. She didn't celebrate. She simply exhaled, setting her teacup down. Her voice was calm, steady. A child should never have to be the reason an industry stops. But sometimes, humanity only pauses when it finally sees its own reflection. Back in New York, Paul stood at his window, watching dawn shimmer off the skyscrapers. In a few hours, shareholders, reporters, and the board would all demand the same thing. Why did you let a child bring this company to its knees? But he already knew the truth. It wasn't Nova who brought them down. It was truth itself. And that slap wasn't just against a child. It was against an entire system of silent power. Later that day, during an internal meeting recorded for the board, Paul spoke plainly, "You think Skyveil humiliated us, but it saved us from losing our humanity. Without it, we would have kept striking just without anyone ever seeing." No one argued. A few lowered their heads. A few quietly wiped their glasses. Across the Atlantic, Elise Tran, now back from Munich, sat alone in the incident reporting room. She had been asked to write her statement, but the words wouldn't come. After a long pause, she wrote a single line. The child said nothing but, from that moment on, everyone started listening. Online, Fly with Nova evolved into a symbol. Images of the little girl with her glowing blue bracelet flooded the internet. Captioned, "In a world full of noise, silence is power." The 8-second video was replayed not in outrage, but in reflection. People began asking themselves if I had been there. What would I have done? That question seeped into newsrooms, classrooms, boardrooms, and became something no marketing campaign could ever buy: a collective pause for self-examination. That evening, Paul stood by his office window. The city lights shimmered like data streams across the skyline. He opened the final press statement, added one line by hand, without consulting anyone. AstraSky will not fly again until we remember how to treat every person the same, no matter which seat they're in. He pressed send. For a brief moment, in a city that never slept, a man who once measured value in numbers felt something he hadn't in years: faith in justice. Quiet, but unshakable. As the movement Ramau Fly with Nova rippled through the world, Renee Langston prepared to address the public for the first time since the incident, not to defend her daughter, but to remind the world of one truth: silence is not weakness. It's how justice learns to speak. The next morning, Geneva woke under an eerie stillness. No wind, no clouds. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting. Inside the glass tower of Langston Ethics headquarters, the 22nd floor had been sealed off for a singular purpose: Renee Langston's first public address since the AstraSky 901 incident. No banners, no grand production, no PR entourage, just one silver microphone, neutral lighting, and a woman about to speak to the world, a woman whose name had become a synonym for conscience. From New York to Nairobi, hundreds of millions tuned in. The hashtag #MyFlyWithNova still dominated every feed. Media outlets called it a historic moment, but Renee simply told the tech crew, not history, just truth. She stepped onto the stage, calm, deliberate. Her hair was tied back neatly, no makeup, a quiet act of defiance, a declaration that justice doesn't need to be dressed up. The broadcast light turned red. The world went silent. Renee stood before the microphone, fingers interlaced. No notes, no teleprompter. She didn't deliver a speech, she told a story. Her voice, low and steady, carried the weight of both a mother and a visionary. My daughter did not scream. She did not cry. She did not beg. She simply existed in a space where someone believed she did not belong. A pause. Not a word was spoken in the studio. The sentence hung heavy, cutting through the collective denial of an entire generation. Then Renee continued, eyes fixed on the lens, speaking not to the room, but to the world. We live in a world where the silence of the powerless is too often mistaken for consent. But her silence was not fear. It was restraint, the choice not to harm, even while being harmed. The moderator tried to signal her to continue, but Renee raised a gentle hand, commanding stillness. Justice must not be born from outrage. It must come from system structures designed to protect every human being, even when they cannot protect themselves. Within minutes, that line was everywhere. Protect the weak with systems, not with tears. A new mantra for a world awakening from denial. Outside, in Geneva's public square, hundreds of people watched on a massive screen. An elderly woman wept not out of pity, but recognition. She saw her own daughter in Nova, a child who had chosen silence not as surrender, but as dignity. Renee's tone grew even softer, yet every word struck like a bell. The Skyveil system was never built to surveil. It was built to illuminate. Not to punish, but to remind. Not to replace humanity, but to make humanity look at itself again. In New York, Paul Dermott watched from his office, eyes tired, yet strangely peaceful. When he heard that line, he murmured to no one, "She's right. We built Skyveil as a cage, but it turned out to be a mirror." In Munich, Elise Tran sat alone in her hotel room, the laptop screen glowing faintly. When Renee spoke of her daughter's silence, Elise felt tears she didn't expect. Not because of tragedy, but because, finally, truth was being spoken without fury. Renee paused again. The studio seemed frozen in time. She looked down at her wrist, the Guardian band, identical to Nova's, faintly glowing blue. We've built technology to measure height, speed, and efficiency, but we've forgotten to measure humanity. Skyveil was never meant for control. It exists so that when someone says, "I'm hurt," the world will believe them the very first time. Applause rose not thunderous, but steady, deliberate, the kind that came from understanding, not performance. Renee bowed slightly. No smile, just truth. Thank you for listening, not to me, but to the silence you once ignored. The lights dimmed. The broadcast ended. Moments later, a ripple surged across the globe. Human rights groups, airline regulators, and even the United Nations Aviation Board called for an international summit to discuss mandating Skyveil integration across all global carriers. It was no longer Langston's technology. It was now being called humanity's safeguard. The movement shifted. Fly with Nova evolved into Row Where Listen First, a global campaign urging every industry to value dignity before profit. As the crowd dispersed outside the studio, Renee lingered alone beneath the fading lights. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the glass wall. A phone buzzed in her hand, a message from Nova Mom. I watched it. I think they understand now. Renee smiled softly, touching the screen as if to hold her daughter's face. Justice doesn't need to be praised, she whispered. It only needs to be understood. The speech was over, but Skyveil's greatest challenge was yet to come. As the system gained global power, new hands reached to claim it for profit and control. In Geneva, the first traces of unauthorized data interference began to surface. In the days following Renee Langston's address, the world felt as though it had awakened from a long sleep. The headlines no longer spoke of the slap, they spoke of the system. And with that shift came a question, simple yet seismic. How many times have we witnessed injustice and chosen silence? It was that very question that brought hundreds to Langston Ethics headquarters where, today, a special public hearing was about to begin. The room was called Testimony Hall, a space designed not for power, but for remembrance. Every light was neutral white. Every chair the same, no hierarchy, no stage. At the front stood a single podium, and behind it, a massive screen meant to display truth in its purest form data. Renee Langston sat quietly in the first row. She wasn't there as the founder of Skyveil or CEO of Langston Ethics, but as a listener, a witness to the stories her system had once failed to hear. The doors opened. A woman entered, tall, proud, with the kind of calm that comes only after years of silence. Her name was Jasmine Crowley, a former AstraSky Flight attendant dismissed 6 years ago after exposing racial bias among the crew. No applause greeted her, only silence, the respectful kind, heavy with recognition. Jasmine approached the podium, carrying a small silver drive in her hand. She placed it gently before her. Inside this, she said, her voice low and deliberate, are hidden logs from AstraSky's old internal system from before Skyveil existed. She connected the drive. The screen behind her came alive, thousands of lines of archived data scrolled upward like digital ghosts. Crew reports, passenger notes, evaluation logs, and then one column stopped everyone cold. Reason code's appearance, not first-class standard, voice tone, too assertive, passenger type, non-preferred demographic. Jasmine turned back to the audience, her throat tightening. This, she said, is how discrimination lives not in open words, but in quiet data. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Those cold lines, once just numbers, now looked like wounds encoded into a machine. Prejudice, preserved in syntax. Renee rose slowly, her tone calm but edged with gravity. "Ms. Crowley," she said, "these logs were deleted from AstraSky's core database years ago. How did you manage to preserve them?" Jasmine's lips curved into a faint, weary smile. "I didn't delete them. I just changed where silence lived." The room froze. Every word carried the weight of 6 years of buried truth. She continued, her eyes unwavering. "For years, I tried to move on, to forget. But then I saw Nova, a child struck not for what she did, but for what someone thought she didn't deserve to be. And I realized, if I stayed silent, I wasn't protecting peace. I was protecting guilt." She looked straight at Renee. Silence once protected the guilty. Skyveil protects the truth. Behind her, the system screen flickered. The old AstraSky logs reprocessed through Skyveil's ethics filters. Event log misconduct, flagged by behavioral ethics algorithm classification, bias-based action, confirmed. The words appeared like a verdict not from humans, but from a system that had finally learned morality. Renee studied the screen for a long moment. Then she spoke, softly. "This is what I've always feared, that we could build a system to protect truth, but lack the courage to face it when the truth is ugly." She turned to the gathered ethicists and observers. "Skyveil doesn't just record data. It records memory, the memory of action. And when we preserve that memory, it becomes a witness, one that never forgets and never lies." The room fell still. Every person understood what she meant without memory. Justice collapses. Renee's voice lowered, almost to a whisper. "We can't rewrite the past, but we can make sure it isn't erased." Jasmine nodded, emotion trembling just beneath the surface. "I didn't bring these logs to seek revenge," she said quietly. "I brought them to remind us truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be preserved, so that no one repeats the same mistakes." One of the ethics officers rose from the back. "Ms. Crowley," he asked gently, "would you be willing to collaborate with Langston Ethics to use this data in future Skyveil training?" Jasmine smiled, the first genuine one in years. "I've stayed silent long enough. If my silence can now protect someone else, I'll keep speaking until no one needs to anymore." Renee approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not just a witness, Jasmine. You're the system's memory, and it's memory that lets humanity move forward." Everyone in the room stood not for applause, but in quiet acknowledgement. For once, standing itself became an act of reverence. Later, when the hall had emptied, Renee returned to her office. Outside, Lake Geneva shimmered under pale sunlight. On her desk sat the small silver drive, modest, yet heavy as history itself. She inserted it into her terminal. The Skyveil interface glowed to life, integrating testimony. Crowley logs archived 07. Processing ethics memory. Renee whispered to herself, "Justice doesn't need anger to exist, only memory." As Renee's team began integrating the recovered archives, an unfamiliar data pattern appeared inside Skyveil's network. A foreign signal, faint but deliberate, was attempting to erase the very memories Jasmine had just restored. Geneva waited in heavy silence. The air itself seemed to hold its breath in the days following the testimony hall hearing. The leaked Crowley logs, proof of systemic discrimination coded into data, had shaken every airline boardroom across the world. And now, all eyes turned to this moment. Langston v. AstraSky, Global Ethics Compliance Review. This wasn't just an inquiry. It was an autopsy of an entire industry's conscience. The headquarters of the International Aviation Ethics Commission, a glass monolith on the edge of Lake Geneva, shimmered under pale morning light. Inside, the room was motionless. Rows of journalists, ethicists, executives, and regulators sat in silence, as though afraid a single sound could tip the balance of history. At the center sat Renee Langston, poised, composed, her face unreadable yet radiating authority. Across from her, Leslie Morrow, the flight attendant who had struck Nova Langston, sat trembling, her hair disheveled, her eyes red, her body slumped as if she'd been carrying the weight of the world for far too long. The presiding chair, a silver-haired man with a deep, even voice, spoke. This session of the International Aviation Ethics Commission is now in order. Subject Langston Ethics versus AstraSky Airlines Compliance Review hearing. He turned toward Leslie. Ms. Morrow, would you like to make a statement before the board? Leslie rose, her voice shaking. I was following procedure. I thought the child was in the wrong seat. I didn't mean I was just tired. I wasn't thinking. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Then, quietly but firmly, Renee spoke. You didn't strike my daughter because you were tired. Ms. Morrow, you struck her because you saw something or someone you didn't believe belonged there. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. No shouting, no accusation, just truth cold, simple, inescapable. Leslie's head fell. Tears slipped down her cheeks. But Renee's gaze held no anger, only the sorrow of someone who knew that shame could sometimes be a greater punishment than hate. The chair called the next speaker Mr. Ryan Patel, passenger, seat 3B. A well-dressed man of Indian descent approached the stand, steady and calm. I was seated a few rows behind the child. He began. I saw Ms. Morrow approach. I saw the way she looked at the girl. It wasn't the look of someone verifying a ticket. It was the look of someone judging. He paused, his voice faltering slightly. When she raised her hand, it wasn't a reaction. It was a choice. He looked down for a moment, then continued. Softly, Nova didn't speak, but her silence made me realize something that I, too, had stayed silent far too often. If it had been me, I might have just watched, like I did that day. And that's what shames me most. Renee leaned back, exhaling quietly. For a moment, she wasn't looking at the witness or at Leslie, but at the room itself, at humanity reflected in a hall of glass and silence. Then she spoke not to the individual, but to the entire system. I don't believe in destroying a person to save an institution, but if we cannot name our wrongs, then our rules are nothing more than elegant disguises for injustice. The presiding chair gave a subtle nod to the technicians. On the massive screen behind the dais, the 8-second video appeared again. Everyone had seen it before, but this time, they didn't focus on the slap. They watched what came after. Nova sitting perfectly still, her small hand touching the glowing blue Guardian band. The instant Skyveil awoke, the moment that changed the world. When the screen went dark, the chair cleared his throat. Ms. Morrow's conduct constitutes a severe breach of ethical standards under Section 7.3 of the Operational Ethics Agreement. Effective immediately, she is ethically declassified, permanently barred from service in any global aviation organization. A faint, broken sound escaped. No one could tell if it came from Leslie or from someone in the crowd who finally understood. AstraSky Airlines, the chair continued, will face collective ethical responsibility and remain under commission supervision pending final sanctions. Renee stood slowly, gathering her papers. Her voice was calm, almost serene. Justice is not about victory, she said. It's about awakening. As she turned to leave, Leslie's whispered voice cracked. Desperate, I didn't know. I didn't know who she was. Renee stopped at the doorway. She turned, her eyes soft but steady. That's exactly the problem. Leslie, you shouldn't have needed to. The session adjourned. Sunlight from Lake Geneva poured through the glass walls, scattering across the polished floor. Leslie's employee badge lay abandoned on the bench, a small piece of plastic, now heavy with meaning. Outside, a crowd had gathered. No cheering, no slogans, just silence, the kind born from respect, not spectacle. A reporter stepped forward. Ms. Langston, he asked, do you believe justice has been served? Renee paused, her answer barely above a whisper. Justice never ends. It simply changes who tells its story. Bio. In the distance, Ryan Patel stood quietly, watching Renee disappear into the crowd. He thought of that small, brown-skinned girl in first class, the one who didn't need to speak to make the world listen. For the first time, he understood what belonging really meant. Geneva had changed. The world had changed. Since the hearing, humanity had begun to ask the question it had long avoided, not who was right, but how do we truly listen to one another? The verdict against Leslie Morrow wasn't the end. It was the alarm before the awakening, and Renee Langston knew it. Justice couldn't stop at punishment. It had to be redesigned, built, taught, and passed on like a living language. 3 weeks later, under a veil of soft fog, the Langston Ethics Innovation Lab came alive. Inside the glass-walled think space, a group of engineers, psychologists, ethicists, and designers stood gathered around a whiteboard. At the top, written in clean, deliberate strokes of white chalk, were 4 words, the Nova Initiative. Beneath it, a single sentence written by Renee herself. Every person deserves to be believed the first time they say that hurt me. No one spoke. For a long minute, the room was completely silent, that kind of silence that only happens when everyone senses they're standing at the edge of something enormous. Then the doors opened. Renee walked in long gray coat, documents in hand, eyes steady but soft. She placed the folder on the table and said quietly, "We've all seen what happens when people don't believe a child. So let's start there with belief." The screens came alive, displaying the blueprint for the Nova Initiative. Nova, Renee began, is not a technology. It's a culture, one built on trust, empathy, and timely action. A systems engineer raised his hand. "So what's our first objective?" Ms. Langston Renee didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver band, a replica of the Guardian band her daughter once wore. The soft blue light pulsed across the glass table. "Our first goal," she said, "is to make sure no one ever has to activate this again." Then she began outlining the 3 pillars of the Nova Initiative. "Technical skills can keep a plane in the air," Renee said, "but empathy keeps humanity alive." Nova's first directive would require every airline crew member to undergo empathy conditioning, not as a corporate formality, but as a core professional skill. Empathy isn't instinct, Renee explained. It's a discipline, one that must be relearned. The training would teach crew members to recognize unconscious bias, interpret silent distress, and most importantly, pause before judgment. "No one is born knowing how to listen to silence," she said. "So we'll teach them." Every international flight would soon include at least one child liaison officer, a trained specialist dedicated to recognizing and protecting children facing misunderstanding, neglect, or bias. Renee's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. I was once a child who was seen, but never heard. I won't let another child live through that, not even once. For a moment, everyone saw the image of Nova in seat 2A, small and silent, pressing her wristband in a world that didn't yet know how to listen. It wasn't just memory anymore. It was mission. The engineers leaned forward as Renee introduced the final pillar, the silent signal system. A discrete network of microsensors embedded in wristbands, seats, or even uniforms, designed to send an instant distress signal directly to the aviation ethics network. No confrontation, no words, just one touch, one pulse of truth. A young Japanese engineer, Jiro Tita, raised his hand. Aren't you afraid people will rely too much on the system instead of learning to speak to each other? Renee smiled, as if she'd been waiting for that exact question. No, Jiro. This system doesn't replace people. It reminds them. Sometimes, silence is the only language pain knows how to speak. The room went quiet again, not out of uncertainty, but reverence. The meeting stretched for nearly 5 hours. When everyone finally left, Renee remained staring at the whiteboard, where faint chalk dust still spelled out the words, "Every person deserves to be believed." She thought of Nova small, composed, in that first-class seat, the quiet that had once broken the world open. In that stillness, Renee realized something: justice isn't an outcome. It's a process. And Nova wasn't a project. It was a promise. That afternoon, Nova arrived at the lab after school. Her eyes widened as she took in the glowing prototype's wristbands, interface models, holograms of data flows. "Mom," she asked curiously, "what are they building?" Renee knelt beside her. "They're building a world that will believe you the first time you speak." Nova hesitated. "And if they don't," Renee smiled softly, gently, "then we'll keep teaching them how." The global unveiling of the Nova initiative was unlike any launch before it. No stage, no fanfare, just Renee, Nova, and the research team standing together in the lab surrounded by light. Renee spoke briefly, her voice calm, but carrying through every broadcast feed. We cannot teach justice through fear, but through understanding. We cannot build ethics through rules, but through compassion. Nova is not just my daughter's name. It's a symbol for every person who has ever been hurt, yet chose silence to preserve their dignity. As she finished, the guardian bands across the lab lit up in unison, a quiet sea of blue, pulsing like synchronized heartbeats. For a moment, no one spoke. It was silence, but the kind that hums with purpose. Within weeks, airlines around the globe sent envoys to Geneva to study the Nova model. Media outlets called Renee the architect of quiet justice. But she never cared for the title. When a reporter asked what she was most proud of, she simply said, "Not that Skyveil saved the world, but that the world finally learned how to listen, even when nothing was said." But even as the Nova initiative spread like wildfire across nations, something unseen was stirring beneath its network. A new, unauthorized signal had begun tunneling into the Skyveil core. This wasn't a hack meant to destroy, it was meant to control. Autumn had settled over Geneva, laying a warm, golden hush over the glass campus of the Langston Ethics Innovation Lab. Inside, where light moved like liquid through clean white panels, the design lab had become a place where circuitry met compassion, where machines were no longer just built, but understood. At one corner table, Jiro Tita, the lead Japanese engineer, sat hunched over the newest generation of Skyveil microsensors. Across from him, perched on a stool that seemed almost too tall, Nova Langston watched with wide, curious eyes. It all began with a single, innocent question. "Uncle Jiro," she asked, "why does the Guardian band have to look so machine-like if it's meant to help people? Shouldn't it be?" Beautiful Jiro looked up and smiled the kind of smile only adults who truly listen to children are capable of giving. "Because, Nova," he said softly, "people usually think about function, not feeling. But maybe you're right. Maybe technology needs a heart, too." Their table was a small constellation of tools wires, chips, solder pens, and a handful of white pearls that Nova had brought from her late grandmother's jewelry box. "Grandma used to say pearls are the tears of the sea," Nova whispered. "So if I wear one, I won't be afraid to cry." She placed a pearl on the work table. The sunlight streaming through the glass hit its smooth surface, scattering light across their faces. Jiro stared for a moment, then suddenly stood, eyes bright with realization. "Nova, you just gave me an idea. What if the sensor isn't visible at all? What if it hides inside the pearl?" Nova's eyes lit up. "Then no one would see me press it. It would just be jewelry, a secret between me and the sky." The room fell into that rare kind of silence, not cold, but sacred, the sound of creation itself. Jiro began sketching quickly, hands moving with the precision of someone chasing inspiration. Curves soft, organic, a hidden clasp, touch sensitive, invisible, a sensor small enough to rest beneath a single pearl, yet powerful enough to transmit a global encrypted signal. No hard buttons, no blinking lights, just a slender silver bracelet, graceful and silent, carrying within it an entire ethical communication system capable of transmitting a distress pulse in less than a millisecond. Nova tilted her head as she watched the design unfold. "If I were a girl," she said, forgetting she already was, "I'd want to wear something that makes me feel respected, not monitored." Jiro froze mid-sketch, her words striking him like truth often does, quietly but deeply. He nodded slowly. "Exactly. You don't want to be protected like a victim. You want to be trusted like a voice." By nightfall, they had built the first prototype, the Guardian Pearl. A slender silver band, a single white pearl at its center beneath it, a micro-emotional sensor capable of reading biosignals and transmitting what Renee Langston would later call the whisper code, a language for the things we cannot say. When Renee entered the lab that evening, she stopped in her tracks. Before her stood her daughter, arm outstretched toward the light, wearing the prototype. The pearl shimmered against her brown skin, not as a device, but as a promise. "Did you make this?" Nova Renee asked, her voice breaking just a little. "Me and Uncle Jiro," Nova replied proudly. "I just told him the bracelet shouldn't look like a machine. It should look like a promise." Renee turned to Jiro, her eyes glistening with silent gratitude. She reached out and touched the pearl. It was warm, alive, in a way technology rarely was. A child not only protected, but creating protection for others, she said softly. "That's how legacies are born." The next morning, Langston Ethics Communications team proposed a grand product reveal for the Guardian Pearl Press. Banners, sponsors. Renee declined. No campaigns. She said, "Let Nova speak for herself." And so, they filmed a simple 2-minute internal video. No stage, no lights, just Nova, sitting in the lab, holding the bracelet. She looked into the camera, her voice soft but steady. People say kids don't understand technology. But maybe technology should understand. Kids understand that sometimes we just want to be trusted, not rescued. The video spread like wildfire. Fashion houses, tech journals, and even human rights organizations called the Guardian Pearl the embodiment of dignity and silence. One viral comment captured it best. The child once struck in first class just designed the technology that taught the world how to listen. Late that night, after the lab had emptied, Jiro sat alone, watching the 3D model of the bracelet rotate slowly on his screen. He smiled and typed a single line into the design notes redesigned by innocence, not by vengeance. Renee entered quietly, reading the words over his shoulder. She rested a hand on his arm. "Thank you, Jiro. You didn't just help Nova finish a device. You helped me realize something that maybe the next generation doesn't need to be taught to be strong. They just need permission to be gentle." As the Guardian Pearl prepared for its first global trial, a coded alert appeared deep inside the Skyveil mainframe. Integrity protocol breach detected. Source unknown. Renee's heart sank. She knew wherever light spreads, the shadows begin to move. The night in Zurich was so still, you could hear the wind scraping against the glass dome of the data center. Inside, row upon row of servers glowed in synchronized rhythm towers of soft blue light, humming at the frequency of human conscience. This was the heart of Skyveil, the ethical backbone of Renee Langston's global system. But that night, something inside the heart stuttered. A flash of red blinked across the control screen. A short, metallic ping broke the silence, not loud but sharp enough to make the night shift engineer look up. Then came the message. Unauthorized access detected. Credential Ryan Archer. The name hung in the air like a knife. Ryan Archer, co-founder of Skyveil, former friend. Once Renee's partner in the system's creation, and the man who had vanished from the project 3 years earlier. After Langston Ethics took full control of the database, a murmur rippled through the control room. One technician whispered, "That's impossible." Archer's credentials were purged after the separation. But the logs didn't lie. The access trail was real, the signal path unmistakable, originating from a secured node inside the Federal Oversight Committee FOSA, a political group long opposed to the Nova Initiative. Renee was woken at 3:00 hair unkempt, voice steady. She listened to the encrypted report over her secure line. "Lock down Zurich node," she ordered. "Isolate it for 20 minutes, and don't delete the logs." "Ma'am," the operator hesitated. "If we shut Zurich down, the entire European Skyveil grid will go dark." Renee closed her eyes for a second, then let it go dark. Sometimes, justice needs witnesses even to the moment it's threatened. By dawn, news had broken across every major outlet. Langston Ethics confirms breach in Skyveil system. Possible political involvement suspected. For Renee, it wasn't a disaster. It was a test. That afternoon, she convened an emergency session in Geneva. The main screen lit up with cascading lines of encrypted code, a digital map pointing back to one source, Zurich node. Access Archer R17. Renee stood before the team, calm and deliberate. They think Skyveil is just code. They forget it was built on ethics, not profit. A strategist asked uncautious, "If it really is the Federal Oversight Committee, do we go public? That could kill every funding agreement Langston Ethics has." Renee turned her gaze toward the back of the room, where Nova sat quietly, clutching her guardian pearl. "We don't protect data," Renee said softly. "We protect trust, and no one, no government, no system gets to steal that." That evening, Renee appeared on live global broadcast. No theatrics, no spin, just her voice, steady and raw. From the White Lab floor in Geneva. Last night, the Skyveil network was accessed using credentials of one of its founders. The signal was traced to a political entity attempting to halt the Nova Initiative, a program designed to protect human dignity. But they were mistaken. Nova is not data. Nova is people, and people cannot be hacked. Within hours, the world erupted. We're Nova trended across every continent. Celebrities, activists, pilots, teachers all echoing the same phrase. You can't hack belief. But behind the headlines, the real war had only begun. The FOC hackers weren't trying to steal Skyveil's files. They wanted to corrupt them to seed the network with falsified archives, fake case data, false behavioral readings to make the world doubt Skyveil's integrity. If the system's truth could be questioned, then justice itself could be rewritten. In the Geneva Command Hub, Girotita leaned over the display, voice tight. We need to rebuild the architecture, decentralize everything. If someone wants to breach Skyveil again, they'll have to take down all 12 global nodes at once. Renee nodded. Do it. Make Skyveil something no one can own. Not even me. 3 weeks later, the upgrade rolled out. The Skyveil Fortified Architecture SFA was born. No central control. No single authority. Every partner from national airlines to human rights councils now owned a fragment of the system, each carrying one piece of the global ethical conscience. Skyveil had evolved from a corporate network to a collective moral organism. When reporters asked why Renee had chosen to surrender control, she answered without hesitation, because real power doesn't come from holding on. It comes from knowing when to let go. That same day, Nova, still too young to understand politics, but old enough to feel its weight, asked her mother-mom, if people want to break something good, why don't we just hide it? Renee knelt beside her, smoothing her daughter's hair. Because if we hide it, it stays a secret. But when we let the light touch it, it becomes a legacy. A few weeks later, outside the Zurich data center, a group of activists gathered in silence. They lit candles, one for every voice that had been ignored, every truth dismissed, every child silenced. Across the glass facade, they taped a handwritten message. Skyveil is not surveillance, it's remembrance. The Federal Oversight Committee's involvement was soon exposed. Several members faced international charges for data tampering and ethical subversion. But Renee didn't celebrate. In a later interview, she said quietly, I don't want to see them punished. I just want them to understand when you use power to silence the weak. You're building the very system that will silence you next. And, in a twist, only justice could right. The sabotage that aimed to destroy Skyveil had instead fortified it. The Nova initiative was no longer a project. It was now a global movement. The United Nations listed Skyveil under a new category, human dignity technologies. Once questioned, now unshakable, once fragile, now immortal. As the Skyveil network rebooted across continents, a single encrypted message arrived in Renee's inbox. No traceable origin, just a short line. Signed from Archer, I never meant to destroy it. I wanted to see if it could survive. Renee stared at the words, a faint, knowing smile crossing her lips. Because sometimes, betrayal isn't born of hatred, but of someone testing whether justice truly endures. The morning sun over Lisbon was golden and alive. Two winds met over the city, one from the Atlantic, one from the eastern hills, filling the air with a restless kind of hope. Inside the grand hall of the Lisbon International Aviation Symposium, more than 120 delegates from 70 nations had gathered. They said the history of aviation was about to turn a page not in speed, not in technology, but in ethics. At the front row, Renee Langston walked toward the podium, her daughter Nova by her side. The room fell silent. There they were, a woman who had turned humiliation into justice, and the little girl who once sat in silence, in first class, now standing before a hall of international leaders. A soft click echoed as Renee opened her laptop. Behind her, the screen lit up with a single title: The Lisbon Declaration for Aviation Dignity. Renee didn't begin with statistics or policies. She began with a memory. 18 months ago, she said calmly, a flight attendant slapped a little girl in first class because she believed the child didn't belong there. Today, that same girl stands here to remind us that everyone belongs where they stand, as long as they stand with dignity. Nova bowed her head. No tears, just a small, steady smile, the kind that made the room hold its breath. Renee continued, her voice steady but resolute. For decades, we've believed technology could make aviation safer, but technology only protects the body, not dignity. Today, I want to talk about something that transcends systems, something machines will never calculate human worth. The first slide appeared a simple triangle with 3 words written across it: empathy, transparency, accountability. Renee pointed to each corner, speaking with measured conviction. 1. Empathy. No flight is truly safe if the people serving it don't understand the people they serve. Empathy isn't a policy, it's a moral reflex, the ability to pause before you judge. 2. Transparency. Every system, no matter how well built, can be corrupted if it hides in shadow. From the cockpit to the boarding gate, every interaction must now be subject to visible ethical oversight. Power must never walk unseen. 3. Accountability. Skyveil can record behavior, but only humans can bear responsibility. No one gets absolved because they were following procedure. Every act that diminishes dignity leaves a trace not just in data, but in collective memory. Midway through the presentation, Nova stepped forward toward the microphone. Her voice, clear and innocent, carried through the hall. I just want to say, if that day... Miss Leslie had paused for 2 seconds before slapping me. Maybe everything would have been different, but maybe God wanted her to, so I could learn never to slap back. The silence that followed was electric, the kind of silence that heals and convicts at once. Then, one by one, the audience rose to their feet. No one told them to. They simply knew this wasn't a technical session anymore. It was a collective confession. When the applause finally faded, Renee looked around and spoke softly. I'm not here to ask for apologies, or to demand that anyone bow their head. I'm here so we can all stand upright together. Because only when we stand upright can we truly see one another. A delegate from Kenya, representing the African Pilots Union, stood up and said, I used to think ethics was for philosophers. Now I see it belongs to the sky. That afternoon, after 5 hours of discussion and revision, the International Aviation Organization held its final vote. Result: 100% approval. The Lisbon Declaration was officially adopted, the first international charter in aviation history to recognize the dignity of passengers and crew as a fundamental, non-negotiable human right. Every nation committed to introduce empathy training into crew certification programs. Establish an ethical oversight board for the aviation sector. Adopt the Skyveil protocol as the international standard for ethical behavior monitoring. As the signing ceremony ended, Renee didn't linger on stage. She quietly took Nova's hand and walked to the balcony overlooking the Tagus River. The water shimmered under the sunset, waves brushing the pier like the world exhaling after a long reckoning. Mom, Nova asked, is it over now? Will people be better? Renee smiled, smoothing her daughter's hair. No one becomes better in a single day. Sweetheart. But today, they admitted that better is what they want to be, and that's where everything begins. That night, back at the Riverside Hotel, a notification blinked on Renee's screen. A message unsigned, but unmistakable. Lisbon. That's the city where we stopped fighting machines and started teaching hearts. Ryan Archer. Renee read it slowly, a faint smile curling at her lips. The world hadn't changed through vengeance. It had changed through maturity. By morning, images of Renee and Nova signing the Lisbon Declaration spread across the world. There was no pride in their faces, only peace. The quiet relief of two people who had carried a burden they never asked for, and carried it well. Headlines called it "The Day Ethics Took Flight." One editorial wrote, "We once flew to conquer the skies. Now, we fly to preserve our humanity." But even as the world celebrated, Renee knew no declaration holds meaning until it's tested. A new storm was forming, not from human hands, but from the artificial mind within Skyveil itself. Lisbon's sunlight faded, but its resonance reached far beyond the skies. With the Lisbon Declaration for Aviation Dignity adopted, the world realized ethics are not only necessary at 30,000 feet, they are essential wherever humans dwell. 3 months later, in Brussels, a special session convened at the European Parliament. Lawmakers, scientists, and human rights representatives gathered to discuss extending Nova Initiative principles into the Geneva Digital Accountability Treaty, a global framework for digital ethics. One committee member spoke, "We have laws for data, property, privacy, but now we need laws for respect." Renee Langston entered quietly. She no longer appeared at the eye of a storm, she was the calm surrounding it. "The sky is not the only place where humans are silent," she said simply. The room fell utterly still. After 4 weeks of deliberation, a historic milestone occurred. Nova Initiative became formally embedded in the Geneva Digital Accountability Treaty, establishing a humanitarian framework for every field where humans interact with data-driven systems. From Brussels to Boston, universities, medical schools, and law institutes began piloting Nova-based programs. At Mass General Hospital, doctors tested the Guardian Pearl Medical Edition customized for children with speech impairments or autism. When a child could not articulate pain or fear, the Guardian sensors registered physiological changes, heart rate, temperature, and transmitted a distress code to the nearest nurse. A physician told CNN, "Sometimes medical ethics are not written in regulations. They exist in the moment when you recognize a child hurting silently." In Nairobi, Kenya, previously a flashpoint for children's rights protests, thousands of school children received Guardian devices. These devices became symbols not just of protection, but of trust. 8-year-old Amara said, "When I wear this bracelet, I don't feel poor. I feel heard." The phrase spread across social media, turning the Guardian into a global emblem not of technology, but of humanity. Elise Tran, the young flight attendant who witnessed Nova's first act of courage, had chosen a new path. After the Geneva hearing, she left aviation, studied child psychology, and returned as child liaison coordinator for Langston Ethics. Her work no longer involved serving high-paying passengers. Instead, she connected with children, the silent, vulnerable voices in the system. "I used to think my job was to protect wealthy adults. Now I know it's about listening to those without a voice," she told The Atlantic. Elise trained crews to recognize unspoken fears, teaching that safety begins with empathy. At Geneva, Renee watched Nova's impact spread beyond expectations. Skyveil was no longer ethical monitoring technology. It became a shared language of silence and trust. International human rights organizations integrated Guardian devices into courtrooms, assisting victims of domestic violence through subtle signals. Schools in Seoul and Toronto used Skyveil classroom protocols to detect bullying, ensuring no abuse remained hidden behind a smile. Boston's Justice Centers piloted silent testimony, enabling vulnerable witnesses to communicate through emotional sensors instead of speech. A new concept emerged: ethical silence, the silence of awareness, the pause to listen, to perceive without judgment. The Guardian and Skyveil taught the world that listening deeply is a moral act. A Guardian editorial observed, "Perhaps humanity has been too loud to hear each other. Nova teaches us how to listen in quiet." 1 year after the Lisbon Declaration, Renee received an honorary EU award for outstanding contributions to global ethics. Before hundreds of journalists, she said simply, "This is not a reward for me. It is the apology the world gives to itself." In Nairobi, Nova, now 10, stood in a sunlit schoolyard surrounded by children wearing Guardian bracelets. She smiled at Elise and said, "Elise. Now when someone says I don't belong somewhere, I'll say I belong where there is kindness." Elise's eyes glistened. She touched her own Guardian, and it glowed faintly, not an alarm, but a reminder justice does not need to shout. Even as Nova Initiative flourished, Renee knew that true justice never sleeps. The wider the system spreads, the more tempting it becomes for humans to challenge it. In the shadows of success, a new echo was stirring. Rain drizzled softly over Geneva. Tiny droplets clung to the window pane, catching reflections of the city's amber lights. Inside an apartment on the 18th floor, Renee Langston sat alone, surrounded by sketches, photographs, and quiet relics of a life spent building something larger than herself. This was where it had all begun, the first drawings of Skyveil, the late-night conversations between a mother and her daughter, the sleepless hours spent writing and rewriting one single guiding principle. Silence is not weakness. It is the highest form of conscious strength. That evening, Renee received a small envelope, mailed from Nairobi, sealed with the green insignia of Kenya's Ministry of Education. Inside was a single sheet of white paper. 3 words, handwritten in uneven violet ink. "Thank you, Nova." No sender, no address. Just those words, simple enough to stop the entire world inside her for a heartbeat. Renee sat down by the window. Streetlight shimmered across her face, revealing lines of pride and fatigue, of both victory and surrender. On the table beside her lay a photographed Nova with a group of children in Nairobi, all wearing Guardian pearls, their blue lights pulsing like the breathing of hope. Next to it was the first sketch Nova had ever made, a rough circle with a note scrawled beneath it, "For those who can't say it." Renee touched the fading pencil line. She remembered the day Nova had handed her that page, eyes bright with conviction. If they can't speak, Mom, at least they'll be heard. And since that day, the world had begun to listen. Soft piano chords fade, in quiet, steady, like breathing. Boston. A pediatrician kneels beside a small patient, gently touching the child's Guardian band. "Thank you," he whispers, "for telling me you're in pain." Seoul courtroom. A survivor of domestic violence presses her Guardian softly. The courtroom falls silent for a few seconds, just enough for her to breathe, to continue. Nairobi. Hundreds of children race across a sunlit schoolyard, blue lights flickering like tiny stars in daylight. Boston again. Elise Tran teaches a new group of flight attendants. "The day I learned to listen to silence," she says, smiling, "was the day I stopped being afraid of being wrong." Brussels. In front of the European Parliament, a small statue titled "The Listener" stands a girl with one hand over her heart, not speaking, just listening. "Oh, this sounds Tim." Renee watched these images on her screen, one by one. Each face, each moment fragments of a wordless hymn she never meant to compose. A journalist had once asked her, "Do you think technology can save the world?" She'd smiled and replied, "No, but it can help the world remember how we used to listen." At midnight, the lights in her apartment flickered out. Only the soft blue glow of an old Guardian bracelet remained Nova's first one. Renee lifted it, her fingers tracing the smooth pearl surface. The sensor still worked. A faint blue shimmer pulsed, gentle as breath. Outside, the rain fell steady and calm. The night sky over Geneva wasn't bright like Lisbon's, but it was still. And in that stillness, it almost felt as if the sky itself was listening. "In a world that shouts," she whispered, and the sky finally listened. The piano swells slightly, not triumphant, not tragic, just human. The montage continued. In Mumbai, children attend the first ever empathy training class. A hospital in Toronto opens a Guardian listening room, a place where no one is left unheard. In Nairobi, an older Nova walks past a mural, a glowing blue bracelet painted across the wall, symbol of dignity and courage. She pauses, smiles, and places her hand over it. The mural light flickers softly blue against the sunlit wall, a close-up of a Guardian pearl. The blue light pulses once, twice syncing with a heartbeat. The screen fades to black, a system built not on fear, but on brave silence. In the corner of the screen, the Langston Ethics emblem appears beside one name, Nova. There is no Renee. Her legacy lives not in signatures, but in the quiet recognition that justice doesn't always need to shout sometimes. It only needs to be heard. Over the night sky of Geneva, as the final blue light dims, the wind carries a faint murmur, a child's voice from far away. From Nairobi, thank you, Nova. And that is how a small, whispered thank you became the legacy of a world learning once again how to listen. In the story, flight attendant attacks daughter of black billionaire in first class 1 minute later. 1.3 frozen. What lingers isn't just the reversal of power or the shock that rippled through the media. It's the quiet strength, intelligence, and compassion shown in the face of injustice. When insulted, Nova and her mother, Renee Langston, chose not anger or vengeance, but calm dignity, allowing truth itself to speak. That choice turned a moment of humiliation into a defining turning point for justice and human dignity. This story reminds us that justice doesn't always arrive through shouting sometimes. It comes through courageous silence. When you stay calm instead of striking back, you show the world that you are stronger than your anger. And when you choose to listen instead of judge, you help build a society that honors human worth beyond race, status, or appearance. In life, we can't control how others treat us, but we can always control how we respond, and that's where true strength begins. Thank you for joining us on this journey through stories of ethics, awareness, and human justice. If you believe kindness still has a place in this world, hit like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel, because here, every small act of integrity can help change the world.